Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the FantasyPros Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Harris. You can find me on Twitter at DanHarris80. We have a great show for you today. Last week, we went a little deeper with the guys from Pitcher List talking about some mid-range and late-round pitchers that you can be looking for in your draft, but you got to nail your early picks as well. So today, we're going to talk about our first-round rankings. We'll also touch on the impact of the Trevor Bauer signing. We'll finish up with a little listener mailbag, and to join me is the great Justin Mason. He is the owner of Friends with Fantasy Benefits. He is the creator of TGFBI. You can hear him on the Rotograph Sleeper and the Bust podcast, and you can find him on Twitter at Justin Mason, FWFB. Justin, great to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Of course. It's always a pleasure to be able to come on here and talk with you. And it's just a pleasure.
And congratulations, by the way. I saw that the Friends with Fantasy Benefits draft guide was nominated for an FSWA award. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. It's really, really exciting. I mean, I think often when people get nominated for awards, they're like, they say it's just an honor to be nominated, and it's kind of BS, right? They just want to win. But you have to say it's an honor to be nominated. But this is a category in which I never thought we were going to be nominated for, because we're going up against the HQ Forecaster, the HQ Minor League Analyst, RotoWires, Draft Magazine. Like, it's all the big boys and us. And so to get recognized in that way is just completely kind of out of the blue and unexpected. And so, it's been amazing. My guys put in a lot of work into that. I mean, it was 400 plus pages last year, 350 plus pages this year. You can get it on Amazon. It's called The Fantasy Benefit, or you can email me for the $7 PDF, justinmasonfantasy@gmail.com.
That's awesome. It's out already, right? The 2021 version? All right.
Oh,
fantastic.
Yeah. We got it out real early this year. Last year, we got it out a little bit later. And so it was my mission to get it out at the beginning of the year, which we did. I stayed up till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning every day for about 3 weeks. And I wrote 22 of the pieces for that draft guide. And I'm just something I'm really proud of, especially just all the guys that put a lot of real good work into it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, again, it's a huge honor just to be nominated for an award at all. And again, this year more than ever, sort of figuring out how to evaluate players coming into the draft with a 60-game season that we saw last year, how much weight you put into that. It's more important than ever to get as much information as possible. So everybody definitely go check that out. Again, as Justin said, email him or find it on Amazon. All right, so we got a lot to talk to today. Before we get into it, let me remind you, about our giveaway that we've got for February. It's a signed Manny Machado jersey to one lucky listener. All you need to do to be entered is leave an honest review for the show on Apple Podcasts or CastBox, and then go to fantasypros.com/MLB contest. That is all. The contest runs through February. So again, fantasypros.com/MLB contest. Just leave a review for the show on Apple Podcasts or CastBox. All right, so we're going to get to Bauer, and we'll get to our first round rankings. But I want to start off with a couple of things right out of the gate. The first is the report that Major League Baseball is deadening the ball. Saris, Ken Rosenthal wrote an article about it specifically at The Athletic. So look, we saw this massive spike in homers a couple of years ago. I'll talk about the juiced ball. So assuming that they are actually deadening the ball at this point, is that, do you think, going to have an impact on the way you evaluate players just generally on your rankings overall? And are there any specific players that you think you're going to take that into account for more than others?
Yeah, so I think especially for hitters, I'm going to kind of take it into account a little bit more, especially guys that maybe are kind of fence scrapers. So, and by that, I mean guys whose home run distance were just a little bit farther than the fence in the outfield. So, guys like Kolten Wong, who I love Kolten Wong, love his landing spot. Yep. He's one of those guys, like, if you kind of take away a little bit of the distance, he's not getting nearly as many home runs in 2019 and 2020. And he only hit, I think, one in 2020. So, Ketel Marte is another guy that people are really stoked on. Right. But he is one of those guys that he doesn't have, like, no doubter home runs. The guys with real manpower, as I like to call it, like the Jorge Solers and, guys
Aaron
like
Judge,
that. Yeah, like, they're not going to be affected by this. Their balls travel a million miles. But, like, this is a really good time to go over to, like, Baseball Savant and look at certain players and then scroll all the way down to their page. And at the bottom, it tells you what percentage of their home runs were no doubters. And that kind of gives you an idea, okay, is this guy going to be more affected than others?
Yeah. And it's funny, you read the article, and I think that if you're just a casual fan, you might read it and be like, that doesn't sound like that big a deal. It's like a couple of feet, right? That's going to be on average when a ball travels over 300 feet. Those couple of feet, like you're saying, make a difference for certain players for sure. So I agree with you that it's not going to be like, there's no like overall change. I wasn't like, oh my God, MLB is going to be deadening the ball. Let me move half of these players down, X number of spots or anything like that. But I agree with you. The guys who are the quote unquote wall scrapers, it is going to have an effect on, and I think people should take that into account. Okay, number 2, MLB and the Players Association have apparently reached an agreement on health and safety protocol, so that's good. So they're going to be adopting some of these weird things that we saw last year with the 7-inning doubleheaders and things like that. But as of now, the thing everybody is waiting on is the universal DH. And right now, there still is no universal DH. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is it's still on the table. Like it's not, we haven't decided that 2021 has no universal DH. It sounds a little bit like the Players Association is holding on to it, even though it benefits them, right? Because it creates more jobs for players, that they're holding on to it as a negotiating thing for when they really need it. You've got a potential labor dispute coming next year. So it sounds like they're holding on to it. But my understanding is there's still hope it's going to be introduced this year. But I'm wondering, you've done a lot of drafts. I follow you on Twitter. I see you tweeting about it all the time. Are you assuming that there is not going to be a universal DH when you're drafting right now?
I have been working under the assumption that there would be. And I'm in my 11th draft right now. So I've done like just a ton. These are all high stakes NFBC drafts and stuff like that. So, a lot of money being dropped in with an assumption that it's going to get done. I still feel it's going to get done at some point. The owners want expanded playoffs. The players want the DH. I think it's just going to come down to how much money from the expanded playoffs the players are going to see. And I think that is kind of the sticking point in all of this. But eventually I do think it gets done. I'm less confident than I was a month or 2 months ago that it's going to get done. So I think I said at the beginning of the off season, there was a 90% chance we were going to have the DH in the National League. And now I'm feeling more like there's a 60% chance. You want to be careful now, though. So, I mean, there are guys that I'm starting to kind of adjust in my rankings. Like, what happens to Dom Smith if there isn't a DH? It's clear the Mets don't want him playing the outfield full time. You've got Alonso at first base. They're not moving him off of it for Dom Smith. So, if there are guys that you're afraid of, especially hitters in the National League, I would definitely start to just slowly kind of lower them down your ranks as I'm starting to do. And my ranks are going up at Fangraphs all this week. So you can definitely check that. But I'm not overly concerned. But if we get to 2 weeks from now and we start to see spring training games and things like that, and we don't have a universal DH, I'm going to start to get real worried that that's not going to happen this year.
From a non-fantasy perspective, I want to ask you, because I'm a Mets fan, so you're a Giants fan, I believe, right?
I am, yes.
So have you, put aside fantasy for a second, are you, pro universal DH, or do you like the National League style of ball better?
Here's the thing. So I was just talking about this last night on the Friends of Fantasy Benefits podcast with Mike Warner. When we first started that 5 years ago, I had an impassioned rant about why the National League should continue to let pitchers hit. I felt it was great for tradition. I felt like it was a part of the game. And I've slowly over the last 5 years kind of come around to the fact that it's kind of ridiculous that the American League and National League have different rules. There's no other sport in which that happens. It's not like in the AFC, you're allowed to kick extra points, but in the NFC, you have to go for 2.
Right.
And it makes no logical sense. Do I wish personally that the entire league had pitchers hit? Yes, I do. But that's never going to happen. So the next best thing is make it consistent on both sides.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of National League ball. I just am. I think when you grow up watching National League ball, you like that style of baseball. You like the additional strategy that comes into play. I still remember when the Mets played the Royals and Ned Yost sort of talking about him, be like, well, there's a whole, it's so much easier when we're in our own park because I don't have to think about things like this. And I was like, right, exactly. That's what makes it great. But I'm in agreement with you, oddly enough. And I'm wondering, especially this year, whether it's a purely selfish feeling because I am a Mets fan and I want Dom Smith to be able to be in the lineup as opposed to sticking him out there in left field. But yeah, I'm with you. It's gotten a little ridiculous at this point. It's also, I realize it was the shortened season, but once they did it, it feels really weird to go back. Like even though it was a shortened season, it's just going to feel really weird if we come into this year and there are pitchers hitting. So at this point, I'm with you as well. Like I love the National League style of ball. I would love it if it was for everything, but I've kind of come around from being like you, somebody who would rant and rave about why it needs to be that way, to being like, all right, well, just makes it a little easier. All right, let's get into it. Trevor Bauer here. He signs a 3-year, $102 million contract with the Dodgers. He's got opt-outs both of the first 2 years. So I guess let's start with this. From where you had Bauer ranked when he was a free agent to where you have him ranked now, is his value up, down, or the same?
I put my ranks out like the day before, my starting pitcher ranks, the day before, and I had him as my number 7 starting pitcher.
Okay.
And so I think most people would think, well, he signed in a really good spot. It's not a bad park to pitch in. It should go up, right? Mm-hmm. I'm actually going to move him down, I think.
Down?
Yeah.
Okay.
A part of the reason I had him ranked as high as I did was the idea that he potentially could pitch much more often than other pitchers. That's not going to happen on the Dodgers. They're loaded. Like, there's no reason for them to throw him out there every 4 days. You throw that out the window. And I've always been a Trevor Bauer guy. I really like Trevor Bauer. I think while he can be kind of a jerk on Twitter, I think he does a lot of good for the game and kind of talking about it and kind of giving people an idea of what it's like to be a major league pitcher and what goes into it. I think he's a really hard worker. He's also a tinkerer, and that scares me. I comp him to being the pitcher version of BJ Upton, because if you remember BJ Upton in his prime, he would go on these unbelievable tears. He'd just be crushing the ball, and then he'd tweak his swing for no apparent reason at all and go into massive slumps. And he would do this over and over again. And this is what we've seen from Trevor Bauer over the course of his career. Like, he figures something out and he's doing really, really well. And then all of a sudden, hey, I'm going to do something different.
Right.
And I just want a guy who's more predictable and safe if I'm taking a pitcher in the first or second round. And I don't know that Trevor Bauer's that guy.
Okay. All right. So you brought up a lot of really good points. Number one, the tinkering, 100%. And really, that's what I remember having that exact same discussion after his 2018 season, right? Great season. You were like, here it is. This is it. The breakout. And it was like, is he going to tinker himself out of this? And he did. 4.48 ERA, 125 whip. Now he comes back. This is a little different, at least 2019. It's not what we saw 2020. It's not what we saw in 2018, right? I mean, we can be honest about it. He was obviously using something, pine tar, whatever you want to call it, as he basically admitted, and as everybody else does. And MLB is basically looking the other way on it, which is good because pitchers should be able to control the ball and not accidentally let it slip out. But the spin rate was up. He's amazing. So yeah, it's been really, really difficult. It's hard to see, like, man, would he really tinker after that? But yeah, he is just somebody who thinks nonstop about pitching and the way to do it. So I'm not taking him in the first round, but who basically are you drafting above him other than the big 3 of deGrom, Cole, and Bieber, who I'm sure we'll talk about a little later? Are you taking, for example, Darvish ahead of him?
Yeah, I'll take Darvish ahead of him. I'll take Giolito ahead of him. I think I'm going to take Aaron Nola and Luis Castillo ahead of him. And then Walker Buehler probably going to take ahead of him as well.
Wow, okay.
And then you start having conversations of, do we believe in what we saw in Brandon Woodruff? How many innings do we think we're going to get out of Clayton Kershaw? Is what we saw Max Scherzer at the beginning of the end, or is he going to just bounce back to being Max Scherzer? So he's going to be somewhere between 10 and 12 in my next update, which will probably come out next week or the week after. But yeah, it's, I want to feel very safe with my first pitcher. And if I'm taking Trevor Bauer in the second round, unless I'm going pocket aces, which I personally rarely, if ever, do, I just don't feel that comfortable. I feel like I've got to, if I take him in the second round, then I have to follow up with another pitcher in the third. And that's not typically like how I like to draft.
Okay. I think everything that you're saying is fair. I think where it comes for me is that once you get past the top 3, I don't feel perfectly comfortable with any of them. It's pitching, right? I mean, you're supposed to be uncomfortable. I mean, you look at Darvish, right? You looked, if Darvish's first, half of the 2019 season was last year, Darvish would be, ranked in the 50s or 60s, right? What we think of them. Pitching is weird. And, for me, I don't really trust any of them, but it does sound like interesting that you were thinking that there was a chance. Did you think that a team might let him go, for example, every fourth day, like he's been talking about and everything like that? Or did you just think the Dodgers are notoriously careful with their pitchers and they have an incredibly deep rotation, which we'll get to in a second, that with the Dodgers in particular, he's going to pitch less than he would had he landed with, let's say, the Mets, who were the other finalists for him?
Yeah, I mean, like if he had ended up with the Mets, they may not have let him do it, but they might have. I mean, especially with Syndergaard not going to be back until mid-season. I mean, what do you really think you're going to get out of guys like Joey Lucchesi and David Peterson? So, I could see them actually letting him do that. Or, a team like the Angels, who were rumored to be in on him earlier, a team like the Giants, who'd been rumored to be a dark horse. Those rotations could use a guy that could go every 4 days.
That's true.
So, I thought before he signed, I was saying, listen, he has the widest range of outcomes of just about maybe any pitcher other than a, injury, risk guy.
Right.
He could, if he went every 4 days, he could conceivably be the best player in fantasy. Not the best pitcher, best player, regardless of format. Because just the amount of volume he'd get if he got close to 300 innings would be insane.
Right.
And if he could do it at anything close to what he did in 2020 or 2018. But, there is the downside of 2019. Like you said, we saw him go from being fantastic in 2018 to reverting to guy not so fantastic. Still usable, still good, but not a second round player.
Right.
Or a first round player where we've seen him go sometimes. I just too volatile.
Yeah, look, I can't really dispute anything you're saying. For me, it's largely personal preference. I do admit number 4. It didn't change for me when he signed with the Dodgers, but I don't think I was really thinking that any team would let him go every 4 days. I think that sounded fantastic and absolutely correct. If he was going to do that, legitimate chance to finish as the number 1 starting pitcher number 1 player overall without question. For me, he's just in that bucket of with Darvish, with Giolito, with Buehler. I'm fine with personal preference with any of them. I would take my shot on him, but let's talk about the impact on the rest of the Dodgers rotation because they have a lot of interesting names. Some people like Tony Gonsolin, who I really like to nab later in my drafts, who I'm a little worried about now. We've got Kershaw, we know Buehler, and we have Bauer. So then you've got David Price, Julio Urias, Dustin May, Tony Gonsolin. Have you adjusted your rankings on any of them with the Bauer signing?
I haven't quite yet because I think there's another move coming. And there was some rumors a few days ago that David Price might be being shopped around a little bit. And there was also rumors back in December that the Dodgers didn't even know if David Price was going to pitch in 2021. So I still think there's another move coming, whether it's Price or Gonsolin being traded. Especially if they're not super close or as close as maybe people expected them to be in re-signing Justin Turner. Maybe they make a move like a J.D. Davis for a Price or a J.D. Davis for a Gonsolin type deal. I think it's going to get worked out one way or another. That being said, I think you have to right now just downgrade guys, especially Gonsolin and May, because it seems pretty clear that they're on the outside looking in. I love Gonsolin. I'm like you.
Yeah.
I've been drafting Gonsolin quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I'm going to continue to do so because I expect his ADP to drop 2 or 3, maybe even more rounds in drafts. So, I'm in a slow draft right now. We're in round 11. He hasn't gone yet. So I'm actually going to kind of wait and see and not take him in this draft just so I can see where he falls because it gives me a better idea for, maybe some of my bigger money drafts that are coming up next month. Where he's going to be going and if that's worth the price. I believe in the talent. I believe in the skills we saw in both May and Gonsolin. And so I tend to kind of factor that in a little bit more than, what is their current path to playing time, because that can always change. A lot of injury risk in this Dodger rotation.
It's interesting to me to hear you talk about this as somebody who has done so many drafts, who's in the process of drafting right now, as somebody who is in all these leagues. Do you like doing them when there's all this uncertainty? I know generally we're talking about casual leagues. Fantastic. Somebody who is super prepared, who's been paying attention all offseason, who paid attention last year, has a great advantage. And so having a draft early is fantastic. You're in the NFBC, you're in these high, stakes contests. Everybody is probably like that for the most part. So do you like drafting with all this uncertainty where like the Trevor Bauer signing might impact, a guy that we both like, Tony Gonsolin? Or do you like more when you draft sort of late, closer to the season where you have most of your answers?
I like to do a mix of everything. I feel like drafting early, especially if I'm drafting in cheaper leagues, $50, $150 leagues, then when I get to my $1,700 leagues or my $2,000 leagues later in draft season, I feel like I've got a very good understanding of the player pool.
Yep.
And where I've seen guys go early, when I've seen guys go late. And it kind of gives me just a better idea of what the consensus is doing. Because, it's one thing to look at ADP, and I think people should look at ADP, but ADP is also, I think, relied upon a little bit too much. And I tweeted about this earlier this week when I said, ADP are a lot like X stats in the idea that it tells you what happened or what should have happened in terms of X stats. It doesn't tell you what's going to happen. And I think people often look at ADP as a way of, this is what's going to happen. I think you have a better idea of what's going to happen when you've drafted in, a whole bunch already. And mock drafts are great if you can't afford to, play in, 15 different leagues
Sure.
or 20 different leagues like I do. And so, you guys have a great tool over on FantasyPros for kind of those speedy mock drafts,
Yep.
Which I love. And I think it's a really fun kind of tool to use. But if you can, like getting in these drafts and kind of working your way up, this is why, I've been trying to talk to NFBC into like doing, hey, do more, like set up like a $20 league, set up $10 leagues, even set up free leagues because they do that for football, like beginners leagues, give people, because once you hook people into the NFBC, they're hooked.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun. But yeah, I think it gives me a better understanding of the player pool. And I think it gives me a better idea of how to execute a better roster construction as I'm starting to get to my more important and more expensive leagues.
Yeah, but it's a great point, by the way, that you brought up. And I do hope you push it with the NFBC because I do think, to get sort of the casual players sort of starting to do this and do more drafts to lower the entry fees that you could do for those people because they would get in there. But I do appreciate the plug, which I will plug now, the fantasypros.com/draftwizard, where you can put in any settings in your league. You can do a mock draft in 10 minutes against artificial, real life drafters that use the consensus rankings to sort of make your picks. And it is good. It hones the way you feel about players, and it sort of gives you a good sense of where people are going. All right, so let's talk about our first round. Now, Justin, NFBC, I know it's both really, or really all of 10, 12, 15. I assume you're primarily drafting in 15-team leagues. Is that right?
15 and 12s are what I'm doing. I do more 15. I, started playing fantasy in AL only, and so when I moved to mixed, it was really hard for me to go, like, even when
as an NL fan, you started in AL only?
I did, yeah. It was just the first league I ever got invited to. It was nice because I didn't have to root against my Giants.
Yeah, okay. All right.
And so I could root for players, especially when my fanship drastically outweighed, how much I cared about fantasy. Now It's like I'll draft anybody. I don't care if they're playing against my team or on my team,
yes.
But in the beginning, it was very difficult for me to be like, ooh, I have to go against Barry Bonds, no. So I played mostly AL only for my first probably 8-9 years of playing fantasy, and then I started moving into mixed leagues, and the deeper ones were just easier for me. And I feel like I've got such a good understanding of the player pool that I really like the deeper leagues. And so when I do jump into a 12-team league, I'm always like, oh my God, it's the end of the draft and there's all these guys still available.
Right.
Not to say one's easier or better than the other. I think they all have their challenges, and find what league style you're comfortable in and play it.
All right. So today we'll do basically for the first round, we'll do 12, but we can talk about our top 15. Obviously, one other thing with the NFBC, does every NFBC league use the KDS, the Kentucky Derby style preference?
Yes.
Okay, so can you just explain briefly what that is to people who might not know it, and then what you usually try to do and what your preference is when you're picking in the first round, and if it differs at all in a 15 to 12 teamer?
So what KDS is Kentucky Derby style, and it's a way of picking your draft slot. So everybody does almost like a blind, silent bidding process, or not bidding process necessarily, but you rank where you want to draft, 1 through 12 in a 12 team, 1 through 15. So if you really like to draft at the 8 spot, which is where I find myself wanting to draft mostly this year, you put 8 first, and then you whatever your preference is. And then there's a, pull out of a hat, and whoever's name get pulled out first, they get their preferred spot, and, so on and so forth down the line. There is a lot of strategy to this, and I highly implore people to use this in their home leagues. We use it in the Barf League, which is the Bay Area Roto Fantasy League, that I do with a bunch of industry and then regular guys in San Francisco every year, even though we draft live. I think it just gives you the opportunity to kind of develop your team the way you want. I really like it. I wish more sites would incorporate something like that as opposed to it being random for most leagues. The strategy, there's a number of different strategies you can use. Like I said, I've tried to kind of pick in the 8 area, like 6 to 9, and kind of set my KDS with those spots early, largely because I feel like there's really a top 8 in terms of your first round, and then kind of a drop off to the next grouping. And so for me, I'm okay drafting 8 because I'm at least going to get one of those guys that I covet in the top 8. And then I get a better pick in the wraparound in a snake draft. The other way you can look at it is, okay, is there somebody in the second or third round that you really covet? That you're not going to take in the first because you know that that's not where other people are going to be taking him, but you really covet. Okay, so let's say maybe it's a guy like Francisco Lindor. You're a Mets guy. You just got Lindor, right? So
yeah.
You really want Francisco Lindor. The ADP,
to be clear, that makes it less likely that I'm going to draft Francisco Lindor, but I like where your head's at. Go ahead.
Okay. But Francisco Lindor, his ADP right now is about 17. Mm-hmm. So if you're in a 12-team draft or even a 15-team draft, maybe you prioritize picking at the back end because you can get a stud like maybe Christian Yelich and then pair him with Lindor, or get a starting pitcher like Giolito or Darvish or Bauer and then pair him with Lindor. So you push your, the lower end of the draft slots up in your KDS. It's kind of depends on what you're looking to do. Some people really don't like picking on the turn. It means they're going to have to wait a long time in between picks sometimes. Some people really dislike drafting in the middle like I do. So they want to pick towards the turn. Mm-hmm. So it gives you the opportunity to, kind of draft where you're more comfortable. I tend to, in my early drafts, like I said, they're the cheaper $150 drafts that I'm doing as opposed to my more expensive ones. I try as many different draft slots as I can.
Yeah.
Just to it gives me a better idea of where I feel most comfortable. And what I've found so far is that I really like drafting in the middle.
Okay. So you mentioned a top 8. Like your ideal spot is 8, right?
It is.
You have a top 8. Okay. So interesting that you said that because I've kind of also, I wonder if they're the same guys, and they may be because it's not like the first round has that many different names in it. I also generally like 8. I'm kind of torn on whether or not I push that to 9. But let's get into it here a little bit about where you're at, because I'm looking at our ADP now. You draft primarily on NFBC, and NFBC is great because you can sort by date, right? So if you want, you can look at ADP over the last week or something like that. So that's great. So I'm looking at FantasyPros ADP, which takes into account ADP from various sites, Yahoo, RTS, and the NFBC, and Fantrax, and then it gives you an average for there. And I have our expert consensus rankings, and for the most part, there is a clear top 5. You might reorder it at some point, but there is a top 5, and it's Ronald Acuna, Mookie Betts, Fernando Tatis Jr., Juan Soto, and Mike Trout in some order. So just start there. Are those your top 5 in your overall rankings? In some respect.
Well, I will say the disclaimer that I don't do an overall ranking. So
you don't? Okay.
I'm not an overall rank guy. I rank by positions.
Okay.
And then when I draft, I, pick based on who's at the top, where do I see tier drop-offs in each position. Yep. So I don't have a consensus, top, 100 or top 500. I do super deep positional ranks.
Sure.
50 at every infield position, 150 in the outfield, 150 at pitcher, or starting pitcher. But no, I would not. I don't have Mike Trout in my top 5. And I think that's where the disconnect. And I definitely have both Cole and deGrom in my top 5. So I would have to knock out probably Betts.
Okay, so let's just hold on. Let's take it like this. How about this? Since you don't rank it like this, but that's interesting because I think there is an argument to have Cole and deGrom in your top 5 without question. All right, so you do KDS, you get stuck with the first pick. Let's start it like that. Who is your first pick right out the gate?
I think it's Tatis.
Okay.
And I mean, you just get power, speed. That lineup is going to be insanely good. So the runs and RBIs are going to be great. You know, maybe there are some batting average questions, but I'm not overly worried about that. I can kind of make up for that later. And I tend to devalue batting average to begin with anyways, because it tends to be fluky.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I actually just in this draft I'm in currently now, I had the second pick and I took Tatis there and I was very stoked about that.
Okay. So for me, I would say that there's the top 3 for me that I like. Tatis is third. So he's there if somebody took him first, because he is basically Ronald Acuna Jr. at shortstop, right? I mean, that's basically what you see. And I remember coming into last year, the big knock on Tatis was that after his rookie season, which was cut short by injury, it was sort of, well, his StatCast data didn't support any of this nonsense and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, his batting average regressed to still, positive 277, but he improved basically everywhere else. So he is going to give you, 25 steals or so to go in. And I think getting speed, especially when you're taking one of those early, it's a must because you can't go. And my guess is that's probably why Mike Trout is not going to be in your top 5 when we get there, because that's really the difference with them. Okay, so you have Tatis first. How about second? If you get the second pick, is it Acuna then, or are you going pitcher at that point?
I think I'm going deGrom. And it's, I mean, I can make here's the thing, and we're going to talk about this all throughout this kind of, this segment of the podcast is, like, I don't think the difference between my number 1 and my number 8 guy is that, different. And I think depending on where I'm at in a draft and, who's available, I could end up with any of these guys and be happy. Honestly, I could, put names in a hat and pick one out. And I would be totally happy. And so, yeah, I think, it's probably deGrom 2 for me, just because I feel like, what has deGrom always been missing? It's the run support, right? And that offense is looking pretty darn good.
Yeah.
And I just think that at some point we're going to have just that everything comes together season for deGrom. And I think it might be this year in 2021 where he, on top of just being his normal excellent self, he also posts 20 wins and is just easily the best pitcher in baseball.
I'm just going to tell a very brief anecdote about Jacob deGrom and why, although I love him and he's one of my favorite players, and I think the greatest game I've ever seen pitched, Justin, and we talk about this, and I'm sure like you, some certain Giants games are just ingrained in your memory. It was Game 5 of the NLDS against the Dodgers, against Zach Greinke, where deGrom had absolutely nothing. Nothing. One of the great pitchers right now in the game, he had nothing, and he just gutted his way through a 6-inning start, just getting double play after double play. Just an incredibly clutch and mentally tough pitcher. I love him. However, my cousins at one point and my uncle, when deGrom he came up and everybody was really excited about Rafael Montero at the time, right? That was the guy. And it was like deGrom's just sort of this converted shortstop. He's fine, but whatever. And he had this great thing. And we were talking about what we do. The offense was terrible. And we had Matt Harvey coming off the Tommy John surgery. And you had Syndergaard. And I was saying you have to sell high on Jacob deGrom. You have to, if you can get whatever you can get based on this year from Jacob deGrom. And maybe the longest I've gone since then, and that's like 5 years ago at this point, without a text message from my family reminding me of that as somebody who's a fantasy analyst, is 3 days. So they remind me of that every single day. So if Jacob deGrom could just, be a normal, excellent pitcher, I would feel a lot better about it, because he's basically the single worst memory I have within my family on the baseball month. However, that being said, the other thing, by the way, is that the Mets bullpen is also looking a little better at this point, right? I mean, they added Trevor May. You've got another year from Betances. Edwin Diaz, kind of, I won't say he turned back into what he was prior to the trade, but he certainly had a better year. Juris Familia with another year. So the bullpen should be better. I agree. It's always the wins. 10 wins in 2018, 11 in 2019, just 4 last year in his start. So yeah, if he can get there, I agree with you. Now, I mean, I think there's an argument to be made. Do you have a strong preference with him over Gerrit Cole necessarily? Because I have him back to back. I do prefer deGrom as my number 1 pitcher, but Cole is like 1B to his 1A.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's 1A to 1B. Like, they're my elite tier. Like, when I do my tiers for starting pitcher, like, they're the only 2 that I would really strongly consider taking in the first round. Okay. Everybody else is kind of lumped into a much larger second tier. I do prefer deGrom, but I don't think you can go wrong with Gerrit Cole.
Okay, and Bieber then, so is not, because a lot of people have the big three of deGrom, Cole, and Bieber, and I do have Bieber in the back end of my first round, but for you, he's your third pitcher, but out of your first round, you think, if you landed there?
Yeah, I think there's just too much good value in hitting at the back end of the first round for me to take him, and so as much as I do have Bieber as my number three, like I don't think there's a huge difference between like Bieber and Giolito's going later, so I'm going to end up with him more often.
Okay, I think that that's fair. And again, Bieber, I look for reasons to drop him a little bit just because with deGrom and Cole, it's sort of accepted that this is what it is. I didn't expect to see this from Bieber, right? I didn't expect to see this massive strikeout jump that he got. So I look for ways, even though I can't find it in the StatCast data or really anything to poke holes in it. It's just not something that I really want to go and pass on all those pitchers, but I do have them in the back end of my first round. Let's talk a couple of hitters, though, because I'll just give you what, let's say, ADP right now. It's Ronald Acuna is first, Mookie Betts second, Tatis Jr. third, Juan Soto fourth, and Mike Trout fifth. So let's just talk about each of them, essentially. I can give you mine. My overall is not that different. It's Acuna, Betts, Tatis, Soto, and Trout, actually. So that is the same thing. Fantastic. Okay, so let's just talk about each one of these guys. Let's break them down very quickly. After Tatis, if you're not taking a pitcher, who's your next hitter? Is it Acuna Jr.? Is it Soto or Betts or Trout? It's not Trout, I guess, right?
It's not Trout. It's Acuna.
Okay.
I mean, the power speed combination. There is, again, concerns about his batting average, but it's something I devalue because of its flukiness. He put up a 250 last year, but 280 and 293 the previous two seasons. I mean, he's probably going to be somewhere between a 270 and 280 hitter with a boatload of home runs, a boatload of stolen bases, good Braves to line up. So, I mean, I don't think you can go wrong with Ronald Acuna.
Yeah, realistically, I mean, yes, the 250 batting average, that's fine. And it was earned. His expected batting average was 254. But realistically, if he stays healthy, he's 40-30. I mean, that's not a stretch or anything like that. That's just probably what he's going to give you. And since he's been batting leadoff since, a couple of years ago, he steals. Like, there's no doubt about it. So there's little risk there. And again, he and, I think I would project him and Tatis Jr. to have very similar numbers. Now, you mentioned Betts a little bit, might fall out a little bit, but I mean, there's very little negative to say about Betts, right? I mean, you're fully confident in him as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was the low man on Mookie Betts last year just because he was going to, a new league. He'd never seen National League pitchers before. And I was worried that he was going to struggle. And I didn't know if the Dodgers were going to let him steal. Considering when he was originally traded, he was in the last year of his deal. And so they let him steal it. He stole 10 bases in 55 games, hit 16 home runs. Yep. The batting average is about as safe as you come. So, I mean, I think he's an absolute monster. And, I mean, I would love to end up with him. And he's one of those guys where he hasn't fallen to me at 8 yet, but I'm hoping one of these drafts he will.
Yeah, it's really hard because I would, if there is a really safe batting average, I do let that factor in early because batting average is a very difficult position, of course. But I don't Acuna is my number one, so I don't let the fact that he could bat 250 scare me off him. But Betts is basically as safe as you can get in batting average. He did bat 264 that 1 year. And again, as you said, that can happen. Even then, he had an expected batting average of 281. So I think you can. I think there is a risk that he runs a little less this year just because, I think he's got his contract, as we mentioned, but the Dodgers, their whole outlook is just based on the postseason and everything like that. They're going to be able to win, right? I could see them getting a little more conservative with him. I could see him going back to more of like the 15 steal guy rather than the 30 pace guy. But again, for me, he's my number two just for that safety. But I do not have a strong preference between Acuna and Betts and Tatis personally. But let's get to the next guys then. Do you prefer Juan Soto? And again, you can tell me if you have any other hitters ranked ahead of these guys, but Juan Soto versus Mike Trout, do you have a strong preference?
I don't have a strong preference. I think you're balancing the long track record between Trout and, Juan Soto's just upside because he's still only 22 years old. That's right. He is one of the best players in Major League Baseball, and he's only 22. Like, I don't think we're going to get much more speed from him.
Right.
And so that becomes the kind of rub is you're not going to get the speed from Soto that you're going to get from a guy like Tatis or Acuna or even Betts or Trey Turner, who's another guy who I would actually probably put above Betts because of the speed component. But I mean, he's just such a joy to watch play. And what he did last year was insane. People forget, like, he only played 47 games because he came in contact with someone with COVID, and still hit 13 home runs, 6 stolen bases, 351, 490, 695 triple slash.
So ridiculous. I mean, it's just crazy.
Yeah, talk about one of the safest floors in all of baseball, and that is Juan Soto for you.
It's really nuts how he's improving every single year. By the way, everybody always talks about Vlad and how they want Vlad to hit fewer ground balls. I mean, Soto has a 51.6% ground ball rate. He hits the ball on the ground. It doesn't matter. He's just like basically a 40 homer guy. And the way he has improved each year of his career. And as you mentioned, he is a baby. He is so young. It's difficult to really fathom. But I agree with you that to the extent you factor in a quote unquote negative, it's the fact that you're right. He doesn't have that 30 steal season in him right now. Like, he just doesn't have the speed really to get there, but he is going to chip in 10 steals, 15 steals. So that gets there. Trout does have the speed to add on a lot of steals, and we've seen it, but we also saw 1 stolen base in 2 attempts last year, and then 11 stolen bases out of 13 attempts the year before. So he can still, it's a great percentage, right? But that's just not the number that you're really looking for. So what do you realistically, Trout's 30 at this point. What do you think about Trout, and where do you think you'd be comfortable drafting him if he fell to you, essentially?
I mean, you're still drafting the guy who I think is the best player in baseball. Like, am I necessarily taking, the guys we've talked about previously over him? Yeah, probably. But, like, people forget, like, he put up 45-11 in 134 games in 2019. Right. So, like, if you project that out, you're talking about a guy who's probably 50-15, maybe even more, supposedly healthy right now. I know people are like, well, he only stole 1 base last year. Only stole 1 base on 2 attempts. You have to remember, there were some teams with a shortened season that told guys, do not run. We don't want you to get hurt. Like, in a shortened season, when there's only 60 games, if you got to go on the IL for 10 days, you're missing a sixth of the season automatically. So, like, why would certain teams tell guys to push it on the base paths? We saw some teams run wild, but some teams just said no.
Yeah. And I think the big thing too about Trout is I realize that he's, 30, which is still, he's still right there. He's still, in his prime, I'm sure, but he had a couple of seasons earlier in his career where he just didn't steal very much either, right? He stole 16 in 2014 and then he stole 11 in 2015, followed that up with a 30 steal season, right? So I don't think I want to go into it saying that the steals are gone for Mike Trout for the reason that you said. And what we've also said, his sprint speed, is still elite in the 94th percentile in the game. So yeah, I could see it happening. And even if it doesn't, what you get is a truly elite 4 category player. But it does feel weird to me. I don't know about you. Like, it just feels weird. And he's 5th in my rankings right now. I bounce him back and forth with Soto because I just can't decide between them. Basically every day I decide to tweak it. But it feels weird to not have him up at number 1 just because he's sat there all day. But yeah, I agree with you. All right, so my top 7 are Ronald Acuna Jr., Betts, Tatis Jr., Juan Soto, Mike Trout, Jacob deGrom, and Gerrit Cole. So you said you liked 8. Are those the top 7, though, that you or in some 7 of the 8 that you've been thinking of? Or is there another person other than the one guy we haven't talked about who I think it's the same guy who you're considering as part of the 8 that you'd be comfortable with?
Yeah, Trey Turner is a guy that I think you can make the argument that he should be going first overall. I don't know necessarily that I would make that argument, but I think there's an argument to be had, especially considering what he's done over the course of, he's still only 27, going to be 28 this year. But in 59 games last year, hit 12 home runs, stole 12 bases. 2019, in 122 games, 19 home runs, 35 stolen bases.
Yep.
There's going to be a season in which everything comes together for Turner and we get like a 25-50 year from him.
Yep.
With a good batting average. Last year's batting average was 335. Year before, it was 298. So he's a true 5 category stud. And he is probably my most rostered player in the first round so far this year. He continuously falls to me at 8. It's the reason I'm so stoked to draft at that 8 spot, because very often I've been getting Trey Turner and I've been just so happy about it.
With the understanding that you don't do, I'm not going to hold you to it or anything because you don't do the technical rankings. Where do you realistically think that you would take him? Like, okay, let's say Tatis goes first overall and you're sitting there at second. Are you, forgetting about how many shares you have of him, you might want to diversify a little bit. Would you think you would take him second overall?
I think I would.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, look, stolen bases, and this is something that I've harped on for a couple of years now because of, stolen bases just go down every single year. You look at the totals league wide of what you've got, and they're drastically different than they were even 10 years ago. Getting a guy who, yes, has the upside to steal. I mean, upside is probably 60 to stolen bases if everything went right? We've seen him be on a 70 steal pace before. So if everything went right, I agree with you. And I mean, he made gains last year. I don't know how much you want to put into it because it was a 60-game season. But again, his strikeout weight, he cut it way down. He had career best basically across the board. And he's missed time in his career, but they've been fluky injuries, right? It's not like you're like, oh, he strains his hamstring every time. No, he had a broken wrist and a broken finger that's cost him time. So yeah, he stays healthy other than this fluke thing. So he is my number 8. I'm looking at our expert consensus rankings. He's number 6 right now. The guy who falls out, there's a different guy at 8. Gerrit Cole goes 10th. That's low to me. I mean, I have Cole 7th, I believe, and that even feels a little low to me. So that's interesting. The number 8 in our expert consensus ranking, and my number 9, Justin, is Christian Yelich. So I wonder how you feel about him overall, because last year, this is really what you want to do with last year, right? If you want to give last year credence, then you're scared of Christian Yelich at least a little bit, given what happened to him. If you kind of want to be like, oh my God, I don't know what that was. This is a bizarre season. He just didn't swing at all. And so his strikeout rate and his walk rate went way up. Then you're willing to draft him earlier. So for me, he's number 9. He's 8 on expert consensus. How do you feel about Yelich this season?
I feel fine about Yelich, especially with the news today that it sounds like they're going to let players have access to video. I think that really affected him. So I think guys like Yelich and JD Martinez, Javier Baez, give them a little bump in your rankings. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of drafting kind of towards the end of the first round in either a 12 or 15 team league. But when I do, I'm usually ending up with Christian Yelich on a team. And I'm totally fine with that. I mean, this dude has the ability to be an absolute monster because we saw it last year in 2019. 44 home runs, 30 stolen bases, 329 batting average. I know the batting average scares everybody from last year in 2020, but his expecting batting average, in spite of all his struggles, was 250. So, like, that, I think, is more indicative of what we saw last year. I would expect him to be like a 280 hitter with a boatload of home runs, a boatload of stolen bases, and you're going to be really happy with the return.
Yeah, I mean, he batted 327 from 2018 to 2019, and then he goes to 205 last year. Like, that's just something where I'm going to say, okay, not. And again, it was really weird. His strikeout rate jumped by 10 points. His walk rate jumped through the roof. He just didn't swing. He had a 34.6%, swing percentage after a 44%, basically, the 2 previous years. I don't know what it was, but it's 60 games of a guy we were drafting as a top 5 player. There's just no way I'm running away from him. I feel, very, very confident. So that's why I'm sort of like, I don't know whether or not I have a top 8 or even a top 9, because the more I've looked at Yelich, I'm kind of there. And I agree with you. Yeah, the video guys, it's going to be a little different, right? They're not going to let them go back into the clubhouse. They're giving them MLB approved like iPads or something like that to let them look at video in the dugout or something like that. But that was something that, and we've heard about these guys who really rely on looking at video. You mentioned JD Martinez, you mentioned Javier Baez, and guys who had disastrous seasons last year. So I do think that that's something to factor in. Let me give you the rest of the expert consensus rankings in the first round, and you can just give me your quick thoughts on each one of them. You've got Trevor Story at 9, and we talked about Gerrit Cole at 10, and then Shane Bieber 11, Jose Ramirez at 12. So let's start with Story. Break it down for me. Where do you think you'd be comfortable drafting him, and what do you expect this year?
I'm super comfortable drafting Story like inside of the top 10 to 12 picks. I think he's a pretty safe guy. I'm a little worried about the lineup they're putting around him, considering they just traded Arenado. But, I mean, I think he's still a pretty easy bet for 30-plus home runs, a decent batting average, a boatload of runs and RBIs, and, 20, 25, stolen bases. So I think he's an absolute monster, and I'm totally fine with him kind of in that top 10-ish range.
Yeah, I mean, he's in a contract year, whether they extend him or whatever they do, he's basically as safe as they come. And I don't know about you. I don't, we can talk about it with Jose Ramirez too. I don't factor in surrounding lineup that much when I think about a player's counting stats. It does factor in, of course, and the weakness of both the Colorado lineup and the Cleveland lineup makes a difference a little bit, although Cleveland's a little better since they signed Rosario, but it is something where I don't let that factor in a ton when I'm thinking about what they look like. So I guess let's go to Ramirez. What do you think of him? And do you factor in the fact that the Indians lineup is getting progressively weaker?
I mean, I don't unless we're talking about extreme examples. So when we start talking about like the Pirates or the Giants or the Orioles, then I start really going, oh God, this lineup's bad. But I mean, the Indians, yes. Does it hurt that they don't have Lindor? Sure. But like, I still think Ramirez is going to be just fine, and he was just fine in 2020 with 17 home runs, 10 stolen bases, 292 batting average.
Yep.
I think he's, going to do kind of what he's always done, which is be like a 25-25 guy with upside for a hell of a lot more.
All right. And finally, I mean, we mentioned him very briefly earlier. Bieber. Is Bieber your third pitcher? I know you moved him down, but is he your third pitcher? He is. Yeah. Okay, fine. So you do like him, certainly this year. He just is a cut below deGrom and Cole.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, track record. I mean, he is an elite command and control guy, but those guys have a lot less margin for error than kind of the fireballers that we've seen in guys like deGrom and Cole. And so I'm just not quite as comfortable taking him in the first round. And so I have him as my number 3 starting pitcher because that's where I believe he should be ranked. But because I don't really agree with him being a top 12 or top 15 guy, I'm probably not going to have him at all this year.
Yeah. Where have you seen him going just anecdotally in your drafts? You've done 11 of them or whatever. Is he going in the first? I mean, it's if you do mostly 15 teamers, but where does he generally you see him going?
I mean, I don't think I've seen him fall outside the top 11 or 12. Like he's a first rounder in a 15 team or a 12 team. And especially if you're playing an NFBC, and this is one of the reasons why, like, wherever you play, whether it's RT Sports or on Roto or Fantrax or ESPN or NFBC, Yahoo, know, like, the system you're drafting on, because, different guys are going to go different places based on where the initial ranks that are inputted into the system have them. And so it's really important to kind of know your ADP, know the system you're drafting on. But in NFBC, pitchers get pushed up a lot more than in your home leagues. So, like, if you're doing a home league draft, don't use NFBC ADP. Like, it's not going to be super applicable towards your league. And so I do mostly NFBC. I do some Fantrax, CBS, some ESPN. I have not seen him drop outside the top 12, and that's just a bit too rich for me.
Yeah, I mean, the NFBC, when I'm looking at our site and our consensus ADP, it is his lowest ADP of any of the sites that we track, and it's 9. So he is going right there. So he's my number 10. I mentioned Yelich was my 9. Bieber is my 10. Story is my 11. And Jose Ramirez is my 12. Let's finish up on some listener questions. Before we get there, though, I do want to ask you about the couple of guys in our expert consensus rankings ranked directly below. And you let me know if you prefer any of these guys to some of the names that we've talked about. So 13th is Freddie Freeman. 14th is Cody Bellinger, 15th is Francisco Lindor, and 16th is Bryce Harper. Do you prefer any of those guys to any of the guys that we have talked about already?
I prefer Harper and Lindor to Bieber. And Bellinger, if the shoulder is okay, I prefer him as well.
I feel like this is the point where if I were drafting now, I couldn't do it with Bellinger. I couldn't do it because of the shoulder surgery, because of just the weird change. And I'm going to change my swing after a dominant season. I need to see this, right? I mean, this is one where I don't mind basically having an excuse to not draft him at this point until I see him in the spring. So that's it. And you didn't mention Freeman. I mean, Freeman, obviously, there's nothing with steals at all. But are you just like, Freeman's not a guy for you at this point?
No, I actually like Freeman. I mean, he's a guy that in 15-team leagues, I've taken him there at the turn. Like, I have a couple leagues where I have Freeman and Story, where I've drafted them 15 and 16. You just want to make sure you're getting your speed along with it. I think, while I definitely prioritize getting speed early, because I think it's the easiest place to get it, there are ways to get speed later. You just have to, it becomes more of a plan if you draft a guy like Freddie Freeman.
Right. All right. Let's get to listener mailbag. I've got to start with your wife. Justin, I have to. I opened it up to her, and she did get it in just under the wire, and she asked some legitimate questions. So I would like to talk to her. Again, she's at Mrs. D Sounder. If you like to laugh or you like to watch people troll Justin, you should be following her. I was talking with Justin right before we started. I actually wasn't following her until yesterday. I didn't even realize it because if you are ingrained in the fantasy community, you see her tweets all the time because she's so funny and engages so much. So now I've rectified that. But let's start with, all right, what's the best way to win TGFBI? By the way, TGFBI is the Great Fantasy Baseball Invitational, a league of how many people in it this year, Justin?
435.
Oh, man. Kudos to you for managing that entire thing. But, okay, so any specific strategies? Obviously, probably coming. I assume you play in the main event. I mean, it's not the same thing, but when you've got a giant thing like that, what sort of strategies do you employ when you're dealing with a big league like that?
I'm definitely more likely to stay balanced as opposed to, like I talked about, devaluing batting average. Don't want to do that quite as much. You can't punt a category because, you might win your league, but you're not going to factor into the overall component because then you're going up against, 430-something other people, or in the main event, 500-something people.
Right.
Or draft champions, 1,000, other
right.
people. So, if you're playing with an overall component, you have to stay more balanced. I think people often think they need to take more risks. And what we've seen in like main event winners, especially, and in TGFBI winners, is that the teams are a lot more boring than you would think. They drafted safety, and yes, they get people that pop, but a lot of times it's not the sexiest of roster constructions. When Clay Link won it, TGFBI a few years ago, you looked at his roster and you go, how'd you win? But he got production from every single spot. And that is one of kind of the underrated things is it's not necessarily about taking a bunch of risks, because when you take risks, it's like winning the lottery. The chance that's going to happen is nothing.
Right.
I think someone said that the chance of winning the Powerball is like jumping into an Olympic-sized swimming pool filled with M&Ms, and there's one green one, and you have to find it blindfolded. So, in an overall, if you draft a bunch of risky guys, the chances that all of them are going to hit at the same time, or enough of them are going to hit at the same time, is just astronomically low.
Yeah.
So I want to be a lot more careful of my risk management. I want to, make sure I'm getting production in each spot. Get the Friends Fantasy Benefits Draft Guide. That's another way to do it.
Of course, right there. Your number one tip to do well. I'm going to give your wife 3 questions, okay? Because if she listens to this, I don't want her mad at me. Her second one, what's the most important thing that you have learned since you first began playing fantasy baseball?
That's a really easy one, and it's a game. I think often people want to really dig deep in the numbers, and I think that's important. Or they want to really dig deep into watching the games and player analysis. I think that's important, but ultimately it's a game. And the winners of fantasy baseball leagues are the ones who play the game the best. It's about roster construction. It's about risk management. It's about knowing your league rules. I harp on this one all the time. Know your league rules and know them better than anybody else, and know how to apply them to your drafts and your strategies. I consider myself, I might not consider myself the best statistician or the best scout, but I consider myself one of the best game players out there, and that's what makes me successful.
Yeah. By the way, one thing that I always think about is position eligibility. I've been playing in the same auction league with a group of friends for 7 years, and without a doubt, every single auction, which we usually do in person, not last year, not this year, but we usually do in person, one of the guys says, hey, is so-and-so eligible? Asks it out before a nomination. Is so-and-so eligible? And I always have the same response, which is, I really wish there was an easy way to have known that, and I don't give them the answer because I have spent time before the auction just checking position eligibility because it matters when you do things, little things like that. It's a great tip. Finally, from your wife, on a scale of 1 to 10, how awesome and hilarious is your wife in real life?
She is like a 20.
Okay.
She is one of the funniest people I've ever known. She is so much fun. People are like, well, is this an act? Do you guys actually, this is who we are together in real life. She's my best friend, and that's not one of those cliche things where you married your best friend. No, but she was my best friend before we ever started dating, and continues to be, and huge support trolls me relentlessly on Twitter. So which is a lot of fun. One of these days, I'm going to get her on a podcast with me. I told her if I let her into TGFBI this year, she had to come on the TGFBI podcast with me and do kind of a profile, because she has she doesn't play fantasy really. This will be her real first foray into it. But she's been a huge part of the fantasy industry because she's been attached to me for the last 5 years. And so people really love her.
That's awesome. Well, again, you said 20. I just want to make it clear, I would have said like at least 23. So I want that on record.
Yes,
okay. So I'm there. Okay. All right. Let's get into a couple of other questions from people who are not married to you at the moment.
Okay.
From Zachy Booch. I don't know if you've ever been married to Zachy Booch, but Zachy Booch, what hitters are you most excited to draft this year that had a subpar shortened season last year? Guys like Marcus Stroman is like a really good example of this. Like, he opted out. We didn't get to see him pitch, but he's working on 2 new pitches. He's got a really, really safe floor. I love him pitching in New York in Citi Field. The offense behind him should score a lot of runs. That, like you mentioned, the bullpen's getting better. Yep. He's a guy that I'm really liking. Guys who had just weird seasons because of like COVID issues and things like that. Yeah.
Austin Meadows. People are like giving Moncada this huge pass because he had COVID and talked about how much it affected him during the season. Well, we forgot, like, that's how Meadows' season started, and he just never looked right. And he's going to lead off for that Rays team that was just in the World Series. Like, I think Austin Meadows is going to bounce back in a big way. Tommy Edman, he had to play 11 doubleheaders with the Cardinals.
Oh, yeah.
Is quadruple eligible, has got speed. I think he's going to be a big part of that lineup. Guys whose seasons were completely disrupted because of the weirdness of 2020 are guys that I'm willing to kind of give a pass to and kind of go back to the well on.
Yeah, and I'll mention a couple of the other guys that we had mentioned. I think really the video thing was a big deal. Mm-hmm. And again, it's not, especially, Martinez, I'd always heard about this. It wasn't just something that these guys started using as an excuse, right? To be like, well, the problem was that I didn't get to look at the video. That we've known about that. Like, JD Martinez has always talked about the fact that he looks at the video. So a guy like Yelich, a guy like JD Martinez, for sure, I'm definitely in on coming into this year. Let's go to a question from Chris Wilson. Who are the players with the most trade value you think in dynasty formats that you feel like are at their peak and you would sell high on now? Bauer is a guy who kind of came out to me after that last year of as much as I don't, I'm not looking to deal Bauer necessarily if I could afford it in Dynasty League, but if you're talking about selling high and value at a peak, Bauer was a guy who jumped out to me there.
Yeah, Dynasty, it's always pitchers, right? So pitchers coming off a career year.
Yep.
Because a pitcher, as much as we feel like, some pitchers are safer than others or whatever, every pitcher is one, pitch away from like a Tommy John surgery.
Right.
And so like as much as I like you, Darvish, and I've got him as my number 4 starting pitcher, at least at the moment, like in a Dynasty League, I'll try to sell Darvish and get a haul for him if that's what if I'm looking to sell guys. I'll sell, any of these kind of, big name pitchers because other pitchers always emerge. There's always guys who we're drafting, around pick 150 or 200 that end up, the following year being top 30 or top 40 picks. And so we'll get that talent influx back in and we'll lose 3 or 4 guys before the start of the season this year out of the top 20 pitchers.
Yep.
And so if you can do that and get a haul, especially an offensive haul in the Dynasty League, I'm always willing to do that.
Yeah, pitching hurts, man. That's what it is. It's a hard thing to do, and there are a lot of injuries. Maeda is another guy who stuck out to me, and I love Maeda. But, he's going to be 33. I don't think you think about that when you think about Maeda, right? The casual fan's probably like, I don't know how young he is. But again, great year last year. I like him this year, certainly. But he did feast on the NL Central, and only the AL Central and NL Central got to go a little bit outside of that. All right, let's get to one more here from Mike. Who's your favorite late-round starter to draft out of Jake Odorizzi, Taijuan Walker, Tarek Skubal, or Mitch Keller?
It's Mitch Keller. I've got Mitch Keller, I think, on 5 or 6 of my 10 already drafted teams. He's been a target for me all draft season. I love where he's going in the ADP. He's going I think around starting pitcher 60 or something like that. We've seen the upside with him. It's just a matter of will he get it all together at one time. I think this could be the year. I mean, you look at what he did in the last 2 starts of the season against St. Louis. He pitched 6 innings, did not allow an earned run, did not allow a hit, 6 strikeouts, and then final start against Cleveland, 5 innings pitched, 1 earned run, 3 strikeouts. He did allow 8 walks in that one, but somehow worked his way around most of it. I mean, I think he's got as much upside as anybody going that late, and definitely the most upside out of that group. Only 24 years old.
I know. I kind of throw out what we've seen from him in the majors just because he was like the unluckiest pitcher in the history of mankind in that first year, and then kind of the luckiest pitcher a little bit last year.
Yep.
You just focus on his stuff. And the reason everybody was excited about him coming out of the minors and this minor league track record, I agree. I talked to him last week, I think, with Alex Fast. I love him. He's a great call, and he is free. He is absolutely free in drafts. I mean, he's not being drafted on a couple of sites at this point. He's just out there. So absolutely free. All right, Justin, I was so glad to finally get a chance to talk to you. I'm a big fan of yours. I'm a big fan of your wife's. Again, everybody, make sure you check out the Friends with Fantasy Benefits draft guide. But Justin, just remind everybody where else they can find all of you and your fantastic work. Yeah,
I mean, follow me on Twitter. I'm super active there at Justin Mason FWFB. My written work is I write daily over at Fangraphs. I write at Friends of Fantasy Benefits. And then my podcasts are the Sleeper and the Bus podcast with Paul Sporer and Jason Collette, the Friends of Fantasy Benefits baseball podcast, and the TGFBI podcast.
All right. We are going to be bumping up these episodes, I believe, starting next week to 2 a week. So make sure you are subscribed, and don't forget to enter the contest to win the signed Manny Machado jersey. Just leave an honest review on Apple Podcast or CastBox, and then go to fantasypros.com/MLB contest. Until then, I will talk to you next week. Looking for useful content, fantasy-relevant information, and the data that can help your team win? Make sure to subscribe to our Fantasy Pros YouTube channel. And while you're at it, don't forget to follow us over on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Fantasy Pros so you get all the information you need to dominate your leagues all season long.